turned a murky, deep red of blood and ash. Toba didn't just destroy an island, it turned off the light switch for the entire world. And when the light went out, the cold arrived. After the sky-tearing geological roar came a prolonged silence. But it was not peace. It was the silence of death gradually seeping into every fiber of the planet. The billions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide that Toba threw into the stratosphere did not disappear. They did not fall back down immediately. At altitudes where rain could not reach, the sulfur gas began to react chemically with water vapor, forming billions upon billions of suspended sulfuric acid droplets. These aerosol particles bonded together, forming a massive reflective veil that enveloped the entire Earth. This veil acted like a mirror of death. It allowed heat from the Earth to escape into space, yet reflected sunlight back away, preventing warmth from reaching the ground. The result was an immediate and devastating climate catastrophe that science calls volcanic winter. Data from ancient ice cores drilled deep beneath Greenland and Antarctica show that global average temperatures dropped abruptly by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in just a few months. This number might sound small, but within Earth's complex climate system, it was a total collapse. For comparison, the Little Ice Age in medieval times required a temperature drop of less than 1 degree Celsius to freeze the Thames River in London and cause famine throughout Europe. With Toba's 5-degree drop, the consequences were many times more catastrophic. At high latitudes like Europe and North Asia, summer temperatures plummeted by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. The concept of summer disappeared completely from nature's calendar. Heavy snow fell right in the middle of July, permanently frozen rivers. Neanderthals in Europe, masters of enduring the cold, also faced an unprecedented survival challenge as their prey herds froze to death right on the white snowy fields. But the cold and frost were not the most efficient killers. The real killer, which throttled life at the cellular level, was the darkness. As the amount of sunlight reaching the surface plummeted, photosynthesis, the most fundamental energy maintenance mechanism of the biosphere, came to a standstill. Global vegetation began to collapse. This was not seasonal leaf shedding. This was the starvation of plants. Tropical jungles withered and grasslands turned into patches of dry, burnt stubble. This collapse rippled along the food chain with the speed of falling dominoes. Without fresh greenery, giant herbivores, megafauna, such as mammoths, deer, and bison, began to die of starvation en masse. They wandered across grey lands, gnawing on barren trunks before collapsing from exhaustion. Their carcasses lay scattered, unable to decompose due to the freezing temperatures, becoming frozen statues of a lost, glorious era. And as the prey disappeared, the top predators of the food chain, including Homo sapiens, fell into extreme misery. In Africa, the homeland and last stronghold of Homo sapiens, the impact of Toba did not manifest as blizzards, but as a more brutal form. Mega drought. As global ocean temperatures plummeted, the amount of water evaporating from the sea dropped severely. Earth's water cycle was broken. The tropical rains that nourished the dark continent disappeared completely. The monsoons stopped blowing. The water-bearing clouds never arrived. Geological evidence from sediment cores at the bottom of Lake Malawi in East Africa shows that lake levels during this period dropped to record lows, in some places by as much as 500 meters. The giant freshwater lake, a life source for countless creatures, was fragmented into stagnant, salty, and toxin-filled puddles. The Congo rainforest shrank into small, isolated patches. Green savannas turned into red dust deserts. The African ecosystem, the cradle that had nurtured and protected humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, now turned its back on its children. For the groups of Homo sapiens living at that time, their world had literally collapsed. They had no concept of volcanoes, plate tectonics, or climatology. In their eyes, the gods had become angry and abandoned humanity. The sun, the supreme deity and giver of life, had become weak, sickly, and obscured by a terrifying, thick, reddish haze. Clean water sources vanished, replaced by murky puddles contaminated with ash and acid from toxic rains. Food became extremely scarce. Hunting trips increasingly returned empty-handed. Large tribes began to disintegrate. Early social structures broke down. The elderly and children, the weakest links, were the first to fall. Immune systems weakened by hunger caused disease outbreaks among groups huddling together in cold caves. The competition for survival became more brutal and naked than ever. No more sharing, no more compassion. Amidst frantic hunger, humans were forced to face the most horrifying moral choices to survive. Across the African continent, silence enveloped the villages and hunting camps that were once bustling with laughter. The human population began a vertical freefall. Our biological graph plunged straight into the abyss, nearing zero. The bottleneck began to tighten, preparing to choke the last breaths of humanity. Look at this number. It is not just a statistic. It is the boundary between existence and nothingness. According to the most complex genetic calculation models, at the peak of the disaster, the total number of Homo sapiens on the entire planet dropped to the lowest level in history. The most pessimistic estimates suggest that only about 1,000 to 3,000 breeding pairs remained. Some more optimistic models give a figure of 10,000 individuals. But whatever the number, the truth remains incredibly cruel. The entire human population at that time, everyone carrying the potential to build the pyramids, write the theory of relativity, or set foot on the moon, was only enough to fill a large village. If you placed the entire human race at that time onto a modern cruise ship, the ship would still have empty seats. We had officially fallen onto the list of critically endangered species. Biologically, there were fewer of us than there are black rhinos or pandas in the wild today. What happens when a biological population is shrunk to such an extreme level? Science calls it genetic drift. Imagine the human genome before the disaster as a vast library with millions of different books representing a wealth of adaptations. Disease-resistant genes, heat-tolerant genes, strength genes. But when death swept through, that library was set ablaze. Thousands of precious genetic variants vanished forever, simply because the individuals carrying them died before they could reproduce. The survivors were not necessarily the most superior. Sometimes they were simply the luckiest. And because their numbers were so small, they were forced to do what nature usually forbids: inbreeding. Not by choice, but because there was no one else left. Tiny groups, isolated by desert and ash, were forced to mate with close relatives to sustain the lineage. Consequently, our genome became homogenized. Diversity was wiped out. That is why today, you can transplant an organ from someone in Asia to someone in Africa with a high success rate. That biological similarity is the permanent scar that Toba left in our blood. But genetics is just numbers on paper. The reality of survival beyond those numbers was far more horrific. The lives of the survivors during this bottleneck period were a nightmare lasting thousands of years. Archaeological evidence shows a severe cultural